Hi, everyone, and welcome to this evening's workshop on revising your personal statement for health professions programs. I'm Dr. Amanda Dye. I'm really excited to talk to you all a little bit about a really important part of the writing process. So, to get us started, I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Do-do. And take it away. Today we're talking a little bit about revision, and I know that folks who have submitted committee applications have already started at least thinking about personal statements. You may not be at a full draft yet, or you may be, but I wanted to share some ideas about the importance of and approaches to revision that I think are going to be helpful for everyone over the course of the coming months, as you think more about, what you're hoping to accomplish with the personal statement and getting ready for the summer application cycle. So today I want to talk a little bit about what happens once you have a draft of your statement. Where do you go from here? I'll talk through a few different techniques for revision that I find helpful. And I'm gonna, kind of present to you each of these techniques and then a little bit about what I think you can learn by doing them. And then we'll kind of talk through different ways to strengthen your statement's content and structure to wrap things up. So, after you have a draft, what happens? Um, you're entering a process that's going to allow you to really critically evaluate the effectiveness of your writing. So, there are a lot of things to consider when we're talking about personal statements for health professions programs. And honestly, one of the really important ones is that you are able to honestly reflect on what you've written and think about how well it's going to communicate to the reader. I always advocate for taking a little bit of a break between completing a finished draft and starting revision. I think it's helpful to have just a little bit of distance rather than jumping right in the next moment. When you're revising, you should be paying attention to and assessing and addressing content. So, of course, the exact things that you're choosing to write about, the structure, which I think is really important, the tone of your writing, the voice, and of course, some grammatical considerations. And in the third section of the presentation, we're going to talk about the specifics that I think are important for each of these forms of revision. I know that it's a challenging process, right? Nobody really likes engaging with revision because it's very labor intensive, right? I mean, you feel like I should be done. I have written something. And, the process of evaluating your own work can be really, really difficult. It's also uncomfortable sometimes to seek feedback, right? You may have trusted friends read your writing. You may ask me for feedback, and sometimes it's a little scary to await that feedback and to hear other people's perceptions of your writing. It's also tough, I think, because when you're writing for a professional school audience, that's a very diverse audience in many cases. Not everyone who's reading your essay is going to come from the same perspective, and so there's no way to have like a single universal personal statement that is going to hit everyone's eyes and ears the same way. And sometimes it's just hard because you feel like I've done a lot, I've put in a lot of effort, I don't know where else to go. And so my goal today is to help you learn some actionable techniques that will help you figure out where you want to go next. So when you're approaching, remember that revision needs to happen from multiple angles, and that your goal is always to keep in mind that your essay needs to function as an argument for admitting you. You want the person who reads your essay to want to talk to you, right? This is the goal of the written application, is really to ask a school to give you an interview and to meet you in person and to learn more about you as a human being. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with the personal statement, right? We're trying to get across enough of your personality and perspective that a school is excited to talk to you. And so in the next section, we're going to talk about some of the exercises that I think can help to start this revision process. So First one is a partnered exercise. So if you are, if you're here live and you want to use the chat to solicit for folks to join this process, if you know other people who are, engaging in an application process, it doesn't have to be health professions programs. Honestly, this can work for a lot of different kinds of personal essays. But I really do recommend, if you have a partner that you can do this with, basically what you do is you try to talk your essay. So each partner takes a turn kind of, telling the other basically this is what my essay is about without reading the actual text out loud, right? So you talk for a couple of minutes each and then, sort of switch perspectives where the person who has been talking is the listener and then the listener is now talking. And then you pause. You take a moment to write down keywords that you think you communicated from your essay and keywords that you think your partner communicated from their essay. And then you share those lists with each other. And what you're looking for is basically, are my perceptions of my keywords the same as a person who's reading or who's hearing me talk about my essay? And similarly, kind of from the other perspective, am I hearing what the other person is hoping I'm communicating through their writing? And I think it's also helpful sometimes to talk a little bit more about those keywords and explore a little bit about whether you and your partner understand those terms in the same way. I know this sounds maybe a little funny, but I think that this exercise can actually be really helpful because it's a really like centered on the content of your essay. So it can help you to talk through it just to understand like your level of comfort with the content that you're sharing, your kind of like fluidity in talking about those ideas, which is important. It's also a way for you to kind of experience the logic and flow of your essay, right? So if you're kind of trying to present it in a condensed verbal form, you might notice, for example, that like, hey, actually, now that I'm trying to say this out loud, this piece, this paragraph maybe doesn't fit with the rest. And then, of course, considering keywords from both perspectives helps you to assess whether your intended meaning is getting across, which is kind of the central concern of this exercise. The next thing that I really recommend is centered on the concerns that I very often hear about, how to stand out, how to be original, how to be, unique in your personal statement. And what I recommend for this is actually just sitting down, either with a physical copy or a digital copy, and highlighting any sentences in your essay that could have been written by anyone else. Here, what you're doing is basically you're looking for, like, is my individual perspective coming across very robustly? Now, I'm not saying that, like, every single sentence in a personal statement has to be completely original, but I do think that if you're seeing a lot of highlighting, then it may suggest to you that, okay, this essay could be reading a lot like a lot of other people's, and I might not be expressing my individual perspective as robustly as I possibly can. If that happens, right, if you do this exercise and you realize actually like a lot of this doesn't seem like fully tailored to me, then I would say it's a good idea to maybe try restructuring, right? Try a different approach to the essay rather than just changing individual sentences to make them individually unique to you. This might be a situation where thinking about just a different approach to the essay overall could yield a different result. Next is, I forgot to update the title of this slide. It's not considering originality, it is a reverse outline. This one I actually really like because it's one that you can do on your own and relatively quickly. It's creating a reverse outline. Basically, if you're looking at your personal statement, either in a physical form or on a screen, in the margin next to each paragraph or somewhere separately, you try to kind of to reverse outline. So you write down the main idea or the argument of each paragraph in a condensed form after it's already written, trying again to just like condense what you're expressing in each piece of the essay as concisely as possible. This exercise is really helpful for a few reasons. Number one, if you're finding that, like, as you're reading a paragraph, it's hard to come up with like a single summary phrase, it may mean that that paragraph isn't doing as much for your argument as you think it is, right? Like, that one might not have as much impact. If you're finding that your summary is really, really long, then maybe that paragraph is actually more than one paragraph, and you might consider separating those ideas or kind of like more clearly delineating them in some way. You also have the opportunity when you're doing a reverse outline to just kind of look at things, in this very bare bones form, and think about how well your main ideas overall support the goal of the essay to get someone to be interested to talk to you. Whether the order of your arguments is logical, it's really easy to see when you're just using sort of keyword phrases, and whether your reader is going to have a consistent sense of where you're going in the essay, right? If you're looking at it at that outline, does the flow make sense in a broad way? If so, that's great. If not, then your reader might have some trouble following. And then finally, an exercise that takes a little bit more time, but I think is actually really, really helpful. I call this one revisioning. And basically, you take a copy of your draft and you start to identify the sentences that you really like. You take a few of those sentences, copy them out to another document, and then free write with that sentence as the first sentence of your, new paragraph, for, 10 to 15 minutes each. This is a way of generating more content. It's, possibly an exercise that takes you away from your original idea, but that's okay. This is particularly helpful if you're looking to restructure and kind of maybe attempt another approach. And you can repeat this process as many times as you like, and then kind of look at ways to put the pieces together. I think that this technique is super, super helpful if you are, especially if you're struggling with generating more content, or you're thinking about like, hey, I would like a different approach, but I don't know exactly where I want to start. It's helpful for completely overhauling things or for just kind of generally restructuring one idea. And I like it because this is an exercise where your kind of starting place is, these are the parts of my writing that I really like. These are the things that I think are really expressive of something true and important about me. So you're starting from a place of strength and trying to build new content that way. So I really encourage you all to attempt some of these exercises. I will share the slides, as always, so that you can have access to the specific instructions. But I think these are all really helpful ways to, just kind of dive into assessing and revising your writing. So, in this last section, I'm going to talk a little bit about ways that I think of revision and different aspects of your writing that you may want to, that you should want to revise in kind of different respects as you're working on your personal statement. So the first thing that comes up a lot of times when I'm talking to folks about drafts of personal statement is content, right? A writer might ask me, "Hey, is this a good idea for a personal statement? Is this like a reasonable thing to share in a personal statement?" And those are absolutely important considerations. I think that revising for content is about evaluating how well the information you share in that personal statement helps you achieve your goal, right? Like, so, is the information, is the content all relevant? The next step beyond relevance generally is about the proportions of your essay. And I will tell you up front, if you reach out to me for comments, in all likelihood, one of the first things that I'm going to say to you is there are parts of this essay that I think you could pare back on, and parts of this essay that I think you could expand on. Very often, folks start out with a little bit more of a storytelling kind of project in mind. You might spend a lot of the intro to your essay, telling about a particular experience, and then maybe not have as much room for elaborating on that experience, really kind of like adding implications and drawing conclusions and things like that. And so, one of the things that I will often encourage people to do is to think about the proportions, right? More of your essay needs to be about the interpretation of a story than telling the story itself. And so you want to look really carefully at every paragraph, every sentence, and think about what information does this contribute? How does this help achieve the goal of the essay? When you're doing this part of the process, you are probably going to be confronted with the reality that you need to cut some things that you care a lot about. Maybe specific sentences that you really, really love. Maybe particular like details or elements of a story that are really important to you personally. And what I want to ensure that everyone understands is that it's okay to be unhappy that you don't have room for everything, but it's most important to think about the contribution that every piece of your essay is making. And if something just can't fit because you don't have much room, even though it's important to you personally, but it's not serving the actual writing as well as it could be, then it's reasonable to consider taking it out. When you are thinking about content, you want to think about like your ideas, right? Like what is what's the core idea that you're trying to communicate, and has that evolved during your writing process, right? You probably started with a particular idea. I know I want to write about XYZ, and you've done that, but then as you maybe tell that story and think through some of those implications, think more about what you want to share with your reader, you may have kind of found yourself drifting, and ended up writing something that wasn't exactly what you wanted to start with. I think it's good to consider whether or not you're in a place that you're comfortable with, or whether there are things that you want to change there. You also want to be evaluating again. What does your reader need to know or to understand? It's really important, especially in personal essay writing, to think about like where the gaps might be in terms of content. So particularly if you're telling a story, can a person who's not you and who does not share your, memories of your experiences connect all of the dots? It's really important to try to keep things relatively simple in the storytelling so that it's not a terribly complex endeavor, but you always want to keep in mind, right? The reader is not going to bring the knowledge of you and your experiences to this essay that you do. So read with a critical eye for what an outsider might question. And again, remember that the more specificity, the more detail, the more individual perspective you can put into your writing, the better you may be able to convey your ideas. When it comes to structure, again, meaning like maybe where you put particular ideas or how much space you spend on particular things, I think that it's a really central piece of revision, and I think one of the more exciting parts of the transformation of revision. Structural change can mean moving ideas so that you're positionally highlighting the strongest ones. You're starting the essay or starting paragraphs with particular sentiments that you think are going to be really engaging for the reader. It may mean reordering some of your main sections, and that, I'll come back to this later, might also mean that you're not telling a story, or you're not presenting ideas in chronological order as they happen to you. Structural change means like cutting extra details, cutting, information that you don't need in order to get your point across. It may mean adding implications. So, like I talked about before, if you're telling a story, but you're not really helping the reader understand why that story is particularly relevant, why you're sharing it in this space, adding implications may need to happen. And then you may also want to strengthen transitions, right? So if you're, kind of moving between ideas in the essay, you want to make sure that the reader is following you very closely and easily. And sometimes transitions can be hard and take a little bit of work to work out. When you're thinking about the structure of your essay, you want to ask yourself whether there's a clear narrative there. Are the ideas and any evidence that you're citing to support those ideas, do they flow logically? It's really helpful to have an outside reader read this. Again, sometimes those gaps between point A and B that we don't recognize because, we're talking about things that are very, very close to us, maybe come out when someone else is reading. I also, it's uncomfortable, but I really, really advocate for reading it out loud. It's so much easier to recognize when something is like maybe like the sentence is too long or it's convoluted in some way if you read it out loud. Nobody enjoys doing this particularly, I think, but it is a really easy technique that you can do by yourself. So again, paying attention to like sentence structure, is everything making sense? Is the sentence long enough, not too long? Is there like anything that like would trip up the reader essentially? And again, are there any gaps in your logic, any gaps in your argumentation? Are you kind of throwing in transition words that just sort of like stick paragraphs together without actually clarifying the connection between the two paragraphs? Those are the kinds of things you want to pay attention to. Um, Things to look out for when you're revising for structure, a lot of time words. So, next, eventually, first, then, etc. Um, I find that sometimes we as humans like to try to tell stories in chronological order. And in a personal essay of this format, one that is, pretty restricted in terms of the space, presenting things in a linear fashion and a chronological fashion is not necessarily the best way to do it, right? I find that it's much more important for the most important things to be highlighted rather than the entirety of the story, right? We don't have room for the whole story of your, development as a pre-professional. We have maybe room for helping the reader understand some significant part of that experience. I also find that sometimes when a person is like telling things in sort of order in which they happen, it can feel a little bit more impersonal. It's a lot easier to kind of share your own perspective if you're really highlighting the things that you consider important rather than, presenting things just as they happened. If you've got a lot of list words, very similarly, it can, especially if you're talking about different experiences and you're kind of referring to lots of them in a row, that can come across as kind of like a prose CV. So, kind of just an exploration in essay form of your experiences. And I want to remind everyone, the different sections of the application do have different purposes. So to come back to, this is a little chart that I shared in my drafting presentation. The personal statement is about understanding who you are. It's about communicating your perspective and your reflections on important experiences and really communicating who you are at this moment rather than like maybe a developmental perspective, right? So for me personally, I don't necessarily find it effective to have a personal statement that starts with, I became interested in this profession when I was 5, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. Much more interesting for me to understand kind of where you are right now with your professional development, and maybe, to hear about an experience or two that helps you to communicate, the present form of your professional interest and professional development. The work and activity section of your application, which is sometimes called experiences, called different things in different applications, but that section is where you're presenting experiences. You're talking about things in the order in which they happened. You're providing details about specific experiences and how they relate to your preparation. And so because you have that section, you do not need to accomplish the same thing in your personal statement. When we're talking about revision for tone, what I mean here is uh, will your writing come across as appropriate to your level of experience and training, right? If you're sharing particular opinions, especially about your profession, are those fact-based and well-reasoned? Are they, opinions that could be potentially argued with, but are arguable? Um, are you extrapolating from your experiences appropriately, right? What I mean by that is, for example, did you have one experience and then, you're writing about it as if this is what is always going to happen in a similar situation? Or are you, um, you know, trying to present experiences in context and recognizing that you have a lot more to learn, essentially. If you're writing about experiences that maybe have some kind of a negative valence, which I don't think is wrong in and of itself, right? So what I mean by that is, um, let's say you were motivated to pursue a health profession because you or maybe someone who's close to you had a negative experience with a healthcare provider or even just like challenges in the healthcare system, right? I know there are folks out there who have like interpreted for their family members who are not as comfortable communicating in English. And sometimes that's a really frustrating thing, right? Because especially when you're a kid and you're asked to do this, it can be frustrating that like, hey, the system isn't providing all of the resources that every patient needs, right? So that I would say is an experience that has a negative valence, but one that is totally, reasonable to talk about in an application. However, how you present it is important. So, if you're talking about an experience like that, avoiding like blame, especially on individuals, and really focusing your comments on, hey, I noticed this. This is how I see my career contributing to a solution to this problem. Tone also can mean things like word choice. Um, your vocabulary in a personal statement, can sometimes give the reader pause, right? Especially if you're reading a personal statement and then you kind of run across a word that you're like, I've never heard a human being use this word, right? Maybe I've read it in like a vocabulary lesson or a technical text or something like that, but this doesn't necessarily seem like super human to me. I always encourage people to, try to write in a way that is natural to you. Revision can be a place where you look for, hey, like, have I, kind of used the thesaurus a little too much? And maybe relax the language a little bit. You really want, of course, to come across as intelligent, but you also want to come across as a human, an approachable person, etc. Voice, I find as distinctive from tone, because what I mean by voice is like, does it sound like you? This is where readers who know you are helpful, right? Someone who knows you really well, even if they're not a person who's particularly interested in health professions or, pursuing a profession like that themselves. If they read it and you can ask the simple question, does this actually sound like me? That can be really, really helpful, right? If a person can say, actually, most of it, but like this part of I'm not sure about this sentence or this paragraph. That's really helpful for you in terms of like the goal of presenting yourself authentically. Um, Voice, can help you connect with the intended reader. You can think about how your essay is going to speak to admissions personnel. And of course, what questions will somebody who reads your essay have for you, right? What are they going to want to know more about? And have you presented enough about yourself and about your perspective that a person is looking forward to a discussion of these questions? Those are all important pieces. Grammar is also something that we want to pay attention to. Some of you who are out there may know that my background is in linguistics, so I have to say a few caveats before I talk about this. First, I and most linguists believe that what we call grammar is a set of conventions. My intellectual people are focused much more on descriptive grammar, so understanding exactly how people naturally use their language versus prescriptive grammar, which is, what's in books about like how you write sentences, don't end sentences with a preposition, et cetera, et cetera. My personal human perspective is that writing or speech that conforms to prescriptive conventions is not objectively better than writing or speech that doesn't. And I think that, anyone who believes in the concept of standard English might benefit from consideration that I think that might be an idealization that doesn't reflect any single speaker's actual use of language. With all that said, right, that these are conventions, these are, you know, not related to the intelligence or the effectiveness of the writer. Some people who read your essay are going to be picky, and most people who read your essay, unfortunately, are not going to be linguists. So, when I talk about revising for grammar, what I mean is adhering to conventions in order to appeal to your audience, right? In order to give your audience the least room to question your writing. So, with that said, common things that can get away from folks are related to verbs, subject and verb agreement. This happens a lot because a person maybe revises a sentence and then like the verb needs to go in to a different number or person or something like that. Consistency of verb tense throughout your essay, right? You want to make sure that you're not jumping around in tenses in ways that are going to be confusing. You also want to make sure that you're writing in complete sentences and that there aren't just sort of like lots of fragments around. Prepositions generally should have objects. Check on pronouns and antecedents. So sometimes when you're reordering things, you might like refer to somebody by name and then later with a pronoun. But then if you move those things around, the pronoun could come first. You want to make sure that you're ordering things appropriately. Common things that people like to pick on are distinction between who, which is the subject form, and whom, the object. Quantification, so less, mass, not things that you can count, fewer, individual, things that you can count. Contractions and possessives, those kinds of things are good to take a second look for. And when you do that process, usually you're coming to the editing round of the process. I encourage you also to review punctuation. People can be super picky about that. I don't include that in grammar for reasons that have to do with my academic perspective. But punctuation is something you should review last when you're kind of finishing up the essay because it may change depending on how you're actually writing. I don't think that it is important for a personal statement to adhere to any specific like um, set of like what are the words that I want to use? I don't think that you have to use like a particular style, right? You don't have to be in like MLA style or whatever. I think it is important that you be consistent in your usage of punctuation throughout your essay, basically. So you pick an approach and stick with it throughout. There are some suggestions here. I also really encourage folks to use like online style guides. They can help remind you of specific conventions. It's not uncommon for folks to consult these. And in fact, me too, because I don't always remember, you know, what polite society uses semicolons for. Okay, as I'm wrapping up my part of the presentation, just some last tips. Remember, this part of the process takes time, right? One of the reasons that I've asked everyone who's applying for a committee letter to be thinking about a personal statement already is because I think you do need time to work through multiple rounds of revision. Your process is not necessarily going to be linear. It's going to be incremental. It's probably going to frustrate you and exhaust you a little bit. And that's not ideal, but a reality. When you are engaging in this work, if you find yourself really stuck on one part of the essay, I encourage taking a break and working on another part, seeing if you can make some progress elsewhere. I also encourage taking little breaks between drafts so that you give yourself a little room to breathe and getting feedback. I think you want to be judicious, not ask for feedback from absolutely everybody because writing, subjective, people are going to have different opinions and you may get conflicting opinions. But I do think that it's important to receive some feedback, especially from people who know you in situations that we've discussed, as well as people maybe who don't know you as well personally, but can help you to evaluate your writing overall. I also want to talk a little bit about use of AI in applications to health professions programs and in your writing and revising processes. As you might imagine, there's a great deal of controversy about like using, generative AI for personal statements. But quite frankly, there are professional schools out there who use AI programs to assist with their application review. There are no like agreed upon universal standards for this in the admissions world right now. I think it's important that everyone review and understand the standards that are set by application services. So these are examples from AMCAS, the MD application, and ADSAS. The dental school application, they may update these for the coming year's application cycle, but so it's good to pay attention to kind of the terms and conditions that you're agreeing to in those applications. I personally am not the AI police. I think that you should consider positives and negatives about using these tools in writing. My personal human perspective is that the process of doing this writing and revising your writing in a personal statement of this kind is difficult, but it's also very rewarding. I think that the introspection that you need to conduct a revision process successfully is actually really valuable. I find, in my own life and in the lives of other people that I've worked with through these kinds of application processes, that the more one thinks about and kind of engages with these ideas, the easier it is, for example, to talk about them in interview settings and to feel confident in your ability to express your individual perspective and direction. Um, if you're writing about other people as well, like especially if you're telling a story about, a patient encounter, a family member, whatever, consider their privacy, with respect to anything that you might be sharing with the GPTs and whatnot. I think um, important to acknowledge that as well. All right. Finally, a couple of resources. So my last writing workshop is going to come up in late March. We'll have a different workshop before then. Later this month, I'm going to have a workshop on building a school list, which I will communicate to everyone. But in terms of writing, we're going to talk about that other important part of the application, the experiences section, and how you can effectively use that space in conjunction with your personal statement to share more information about yourself with schools. I have a link here to some good resources, including like some style guides and things like that from the Writing Fellows. And keep an eye out for later this spring an announcement about conferences with Writing Fellows. We usually offer some in collaboration. So that folks can get like that third party perspective on is this writing effective, right? And so more to come on that. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can come back to you all. And I'm happy to answer any questions. You're welcome to raise a hand, use your microphone, or pop questions in the chat. Or if there aren't any questions, we can wrap things up here. Um, I really appreciate you all spending this hour with me and thinking more about revising. I know it's a big task, but as I said before, I think it's a rewarding one. I really do. I think you're going to learn things about yourself and be better equipped for your application process by engaging with revision in good faith. So, doesn't look like there are any questions, so I'm going to wrap things up here. I'll share the recording and slides later this week, and best of luck to everyone as you are working through those revisions. Have a great evening, everybody.